Welcome to the Made in Migration podcast, brought to you by Lawgration, the specialist law firm that helps navigate the complex world of Australian immigration and citizenship law. Here we'll talk about all things to do with migrating to Australia. We're going to learn, grow and be inspired together. Make sure you subscribe and let us be partners on your journey. You're listening to a Lawgration production. This podcast is intended for education and/or entertainment purposes only. All content is current at the time of recording and subject to change without prior notice. While Lawgration is an incorporated legal practice, we are not aware of your personal circumstances, needs or goals, and information contained in this podcast should not be construed as legal, immigration or other advice. Before acting on any information in this podcast, you should always query whether it is relevant to your circumstances and consult an Australian immigration lawyer or registered migration agent. Today, I'm joined by someone who spent decades at the forefront of Australia's economic and labour market research, Professor Sue Richardson AM. She's an economist and emeritus professor at Flinders University, whose career has spanned roles at the Productivity Commission, the Fair Work Commission, and the National Skills Commission. She's renowned for her work examining how employment, wages, and education intersect with broader economic and social outcomes. Her insights into the labour market impacts of migration are grounded in deep empirical research and a lifelong commitment to evidence-based policy. In this episode, we'll unpack the complex relationship between migration and Australia's workforce, what's working, what's not, and how policy could evolve to meet future needs. So let's get started. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you very much, Sudar. It's very nice to be here, and that's a very generous introduction.
You've had a long-standing interest in the Australian labour market and workforce dynamics. What drew you to explore how migration intersects with these themes?
As you've set out, I've had a long professional interest in the Australian labour market. And of course, Australia is a very high migration country. Maybe not everybody is aware of just how distinctive we are in that respect. But just to point out, for example, the Australian population is about 0.3% of the global population. That's a very tiny little number, less than 1/3 of the global population, but we have 2.8% of global migrants. And it's also true that of our population growth in recent years, 2/3 of that is coming from migration rather than from natural increase. So migration's a very big deal in Australia. And of course, it has all sorts of consequences for the nature of our country, but that includes a labour force, because many of our migrants are employed, and of course they all also consume the goods and services that are produced in the country. So they influence the character of our demand as well as supplying skills and effort to the production of our goods and services. For myself, I'm aware that Australia, when I first started taking a serious interest in migration and its impacts on the Australian labour market, it was in the early 2000s. And at that point, Australia was quite distinctive in its migration policy from having a focus on skills for its permanent residents in particular. And it did this very well, and it was something of an international leader in the nature of its migration policy. And it largely avoided a migrant underclass or of relatively low-skilled and low-paid workers, which was quite common in other high-income countries. People might think of the United States, the issue that Germany had with guest workers. So Australia was very focused on avoiding that and instead achieving permanent migration that was focused particularly on getting high-skilled workers. And in the late 1990s and early 2000s, the Commonwealth introduced a survey called the Longitudinal Survey of Immigrants to Australia. This was pioneering globally. And the first one interviewed migrants about 6 months after they arrived, and then on another 2 occasions, about 18 months and then about 4 years after they arrived in Australia. They had quite high response rates. I'm not sure exactly what they did to get these people to respond, but they were cooperative. And that's important because it's a pretty representative sample of the immigrants to Australia. Now, at the time, I was the director of the National Institute of Labour Studies at Flinders University. And we did, for the Commonwealth Government, the early analysis of the longitudinal survey of immigrants to Australia. So we identified the experience of migrants in those early years of settlement and the different classes of migrants and what sort of outcomes they had and whether they were able to use their skills. Was it achieving the objectives of the government as they identified them at the time? So it's that background that got me particularly engaged in the link between immigrants and the labour market. And we also did analysis of the subsequent longitudinal survey, which was conducted a few years after the first one.
That's really interesting because, as you sort of indicated, I think it was post the mid 90s where we really recalibrated our migration program with the 70-30 sort of split, 70% in favor of, roughly that is 70% in favor of skilled migration and the remaining 30 being family. Perhaps then, historically, how would you describe the role migration's played in shaping Australia's labour market, particularly post World War II?
Migration, of course, has been really important in Australia since the Second World War, in fact, since white settlement, really. Australia is absolutely founded on migrants. The big issue is, when did they arrive? And if we're outside, of course, the Indigenous people have been here forever. So post Second World War, of course, there was a strong migration from Europe, including refugees, but particularly Southern Europe. We've always had a strong migration from the United Kingdom, and we were very focused on European migration at that time. We were quite uninterested or even antagonistic to migration from our region and the Asian countries in particular. Some people will be old enough to remember the White Australia policy, and it was quite explicitly selected on the basis that you were of European origin. And of course, we had many migrants from Southern Europe, from Greece and Italy, but we also had migrants from the UK. Now, that, of course, is very different from our current migration strategy. Of course, we did extremely well with getting some very smart people in the refugee component during and after the Second World War. Some of our most outstanding citizens were migrants from that cohort. So does it shape the Australian labour market? Would the Australian labour market look very different if we hadn't had migration? It's hard to imagine. The country would be much smaller. It would be much more Anglo. It would be much less diverse in its thinking and its culture, but basically it would probably still be an advanced Western economy with homegrown talent instead of the talents that the migrants bring with us. So the country would have looked very different. Would the economy have looked very different? I'm sure it must have, but I can't really articulate for you.
What do you think are the most significant economic myths or misunderstandings in public discourse around migration in Australia today?
I think that there are probably two misapprehensions, and probably not in the same, that one person doesn't hold both of them. For some people, when they think about immigration to Australia, they think about refugees and our humanitarian program and all the controversy about people coming uninvited through what's sometimes simplified as illegal immigration, on boats and so on. Of course, most people who come to Australia uninvited and stay here actually fly in, come on aeroplanes, they don't come on boats. And they have a temporary visa of some sort, and then they disappear out of the reach of the immigration officials. That's the main source of our, quote, illegal, quote, migrants. It's worth bearing in mind when we think of our refugee or humanitarian program. First of all, it's a very small part of Australia's overall migration program. And the second thing is that for the size of our country, we are big in our intake of refugees. So for a country our size, we take more refugees than most other countries, at about 20,000 people. They're coming by invitation as part of the humanitarian program. So that's one, I think, misunderstanding in some people's minds around migration. I think the other one is, for other people, that it's the permanent migration program that's the dominant one. And that is people who have visas that allow them to remain permanently in Australia. They don't have to be citizens, but after a period as a permanent migrant, you can apply for citizenship, and most people who apply are accepted. So there are these different categories. There's people who are new citizens to Australia, and that gives them all the rights of citizenship, a passport, a requirement to vote, and so on. Then there are people who are on permanent residency visas who can stay here as long as they like. They don't need to become citizens, but they can. And they're the ones where there's a particular focus on skills, of the skills of the people who are invited to come on a permanent visa. Now, again, it's an important part of our migration program, but it's still pretty small. In the latest 2023-24, net overseas migration to Australia was 667,000 people. So that's people coming to Australia broadly for a year or more, minus people who've left Australia for a longer period, for more than a year.
This is the NOM, what's
This
referred
is the
to as
net
the NOM.
overseas migration. So it's a measure of the net inflow into Australia, leaving aside tourists and people who are just here for a short time. All the people coming into Australia, and then subtracting from that all the people leaving Australia. Again, not just as tourists or short-term departures, but people leaving for a longer period. So it's kind of a measure of the addition to our population, leaving aside tourists or temporary, short-term visitors. 667,000, that's a very big number. Out of that number, 91,000 were permanent residents. That is, people coming with a visa that allows them to stay in Australia. So you can see that the permanent program, while it's important and carefully constructed, is a tiny fraction of the total number of people who come to Australia in a year. In addition to the permanent ones, we had about 60,000 Australians returning to Australia, so people who are already permanent residents or citizens coming back to Australia. People may not be aware that if you're a citizen of New Zealand, you can come to Australia anytime you like and stay as long as you like. You don't need a visa and you don't need any sort of permission. You just arrive and hang about as long as you wish to. And out of that 667,000, 51,000 were New Zealanders. We currently have about 600,000 people born in New Zealand who currently live in Australia. So that's quite a big contribution to our population. And then the big number, and so getting these sort of appreciation of where our migrants, what sort of types of migrants we have, it helps to have these numbers broadly in your mind. The really big number is the temporary migrants. Now, these are people who've got visas that allow them to stay in Australia for a number of years, but they're not entitled to stay permanently. And in 2023-24, there were 465,000 of those. So you can see it's overwhelmingly the dominant type of migrant that we have. These people are mostly students, working holiday makers, people on temporary employer-sponsored visas. Many of these have a right to work. So they're not just here studying and having a holiday. They're entitled to work, and many of them do. So, you know, currently, if we just look at the stock of those people, not the ones who came in the last year, but the ones who are here have come on these temporary visas, we have 1.8 million people on temporary visas who have a right to work. Not unlimited rights to work. Students have a limit on how many hours they can work, like 48 hours a fortnight, I think it is, during term time. But that's a very substantial addition to our workforce.
There's been a marked shift towards temporary migration in Australia over the past 2 decades. In terms of the longer term economic and social implications of this shift, do you have any thoughts there?
I think it's something that has to be carefully managed. Temporary migrants, first of all, it's worth pointing out that a majority of the people who get permanent visas have already been in Australia on a temporary migration visa. So they come here, they've visited a number of times, they come here as a student or on temporary employer-sponsored visa, and they look around and they decide they want to stay here. So they apply for a permanent visa. Now, in a way, that's quite an attractive pathway, because the migrant gets to look at Australia and decide, is that where you really want to make your home? And they understand what they're getting into, if you like, and they come to appreciate how our culture and our politics and our labour market works. But the drawback of the big temporary program is, first of all, I think it's uncapped. The government doesn't set the numbers, although it's beginning to now set the numbers for students.
Should there be an instrument whereby the government can determine the number of temporary migrants in any given particular period?
I think there should be a cap on our temporary migrants, yes. And the principal reason is, well, there are two principal reasons. One is that I think the rate of growth of population is exceeding our capacity to absorb that rate of growth, because with every worker and every person, there comes a need for accommodation, services, and if you're a worker, the capital equipment that helps to make you a productive person. And we're not growing those at the same rate as we're growing the population. And that's what's causing real stresses in our public infrastructure, but also if you just add workers to the workforce and you don't add the complementary capital, then your productivity goes down. And I think that there are signs that that's happening, because investment by private firms in Australia is low. It's not matching the growth of the labour force, and that's, I think, one of the reasons why our productivity is going down. So that's one reason. The second reason is that temporary migrants are more vulnerable to being exploited by their employers. A lot of them are on visas that depend on, if they're employer-sponsored, that depend on staying with their current employer. And if the current employer says, no, I'm not going to employ you anymore, they have to leave the country. And now that puts them in a very vulnerable position. And I think that there is disturbing evidence that there is systematic exploitation of some of our temporary workers in terms of underpaying them and very crowded accommodation. They don't know their rights. If they did know their rights, they wouldn't want to claim them because they think they'll lose their job and hence their visa. So I do think that this is a really disturbing development and something that we're not experienced at handling. We don't have the proper enforcement and supervision of the labour hire firms and the migration agents and the others that are facilitating this sort of behaviour, or the employers that are systematically using workers on temporary visas in ways that don't accord with our labour standards.
Is there an impact of those practices that you just described on the conditions that Australian workers then face?
That's a very good question, Sidara. And look, I don't actually know the answer to that. I've not seen a good piece of analysis on that question. It doesn't mean that there hasn't been one, it's just that I'm not aware of it if there has. But it's inevitable, it seems to me. I mean, if you want to be, a gig worker doing deliveries, or you're out there in the agricultural sector working on farms, or you're in the hospitality sector working in kitchens and so on. And I'm just identifying a few areas where there are worries about exploitation of temporary migrants, including students. There are enough examples that I'm not making this up. That there's clear evidence of this. Then if you're an Australian who wants to be doing those sort of jobs, then that's the competition. And it does worry me that if we think even of the students and the working holiday makers, these are pretty bright, energetic, socially adept, and reasonably entrepreneurial people, and they're competing for our low-skilled jobs with people, who don't have higher education. Maybe they don't have that degree of sort of self-confidence and so on. And so it makes it harder, I think, for those of our own population who are a good fit for our relatively low-wage jobs to get them on decent terms.
This is certainly a fascinating topic, Professor Richardson. So you've got certain employers, whether they're in various industries, but certain employers will throw their arms up and say, look, we just don't have access to the labour that we need to grow our businesses, and it's all very frustrating, etc. At the same time, there are people tend to say, oh, well, if you pay them the going rate, if so to speak, in whatever it is in Australia, perhaps you might be able to attract the relevant labour that you need. So is that sort of, on a very sort of simplified level, is that roughly where you're coming to this from? It's just a matter of offering the right paying conditions, and the various labour market shortages that are often complained about perhaps are not as acute as some may suggest.
It's a very good question. So there is an understandable, I guess, if you're running a business and you want to be able to, you've got customers and you need more workers to produce whatever it is you're selling. It's very frustrating if you can't find those extra workers reasonably easily and of the quality that you want for the wages and conditions that you're offering. But that's the way a free market works. If you're a firm, a very important part of the tasks of an enterprise is assembling and maintaining and managing its workforce. This is not an obligation that society has to individual firms. It's not an obligation that a government has to individual firms. It's their job to work out how they're going to get their workers. And I don't think that it's an appropriate response when firms say, oh, we're having trouble finding workers, that you just say, oh, well, then bring them in from overseas. As if being a worker is the only thing that matters, or supplying easy labour to firms is the only thing that matters. It has major implications for the rest of the society when we look overseas as a first response to troubles that firms are having in getting their workers. And I might say that you hear much more of this, of course, when we have low unemployment. And firms often, because it feels the same to them, they will say there's a skill shortage, when what they really mean is we advertise a job and we don't get enough applicants of the quality that we want. So that's not the same thing as a skill shortage. That's just saying we have low unemployment. And low unemployment is a huge success for the labour market. Low unemployment feels like a worker shortage to the firm, but it feels like an abundance of jobs to the workers. And that's a good thing. Getting a job, and getting a decent job, and having it properly paid and respectful relationships with the firm is an extraordinarily important thing in the lives of everybody who wants to be in the workforce. So I think we need to think of this from the point of view of the workers as well as the firms. And I think put the obligation back on the employers much more to do their job, which is to manage their workforce without just giving them an easy out that says, oh, if we can't find what we want in Australia, we'll go overseas.
That's very fascinating, that perspective. Is there something to be said about our education system here as well? Is our education system as a whole, obviously it's multi-tiered, states, and you've got your vocational education, etc. But just as a whole, do you think that the education sector in Australia is pulling its weight, so to speak, when it comes to training and equipping Australians for the workforce needs of the Australian economy moving forward?
The short answer is yes, I do. And now there are a number of qualifications to that. But the first thing is that workers have a view about what they want to do. It's not just what so that's it's a two-way thing. You say, equip the economy with the skills that firms need, but you might also say, equip the economy with the type of jobs that workers want, which are not necessarily the same thing. So it's the individual person who decides what skills they want to develop, and then they look around to see if there's someone who wants to employ them to use those skills. Look, the fact that our universities and to some extent our TAFEs are so attractive to international students is, a very concrete evidence that they're doing a good job. And I think that they're really impressive. They can charge a lot of money, and people from overseas still want to come and learn and get the skills and broader education that's available in our tertiary education sector. Now, I do know that we've had a problem, particularly when we expanded the range of organisations that could grant qualifications, that we got some very dodgy operators. There was money to be made and people were completely unscrupulous in the way that they did it. And that, I think, has been a pretty distressing episode in our vocational education sector. I think it's getting on top of that a bit, but I'm not sure we have completely. The thing that worries me most, I think, is what's going on at the school level for amongst children who are in, the lower half, if you like, of the academic capacities and the socioeconomic status. To be perfectly honest, our move towards private schooling, I think, distresses me because it's getting close to the point where the public system is used only by people who don't have the money or the interest to go to a private school. And that's very bad, in my view, for the quality of education in the public sector and for intergenerational inequality. But leaving that aside, the evidence from the PISA, now I always forget what PISA stands for, but it's an international assessment of the achievement of school students at various levels in maths and science and languages. And the evidence from that is the Australian schooling system is not doing well. It's not doing as well as we used to compared with other countries. And there's very distressing evidence that many students usually from the lower socioeconomic families and areas are leaving school without real competence in basic arithmetic, mathematics, knowledge of how our political system works, and language, writing, spelling, reading. And they're the foundation skills for anything that you want to do after that. So I am concerned about what's going on in the school system.
Professor Richardson, you've mentioned productivity in our conversation today. Do you think when migration When it works at its best, so to speak, do you think that it can be an effective tool to lift Australia's long-term productivity growth? And if so, what are the conditions necessary for that productivity growth?
Yes, so that again is a very good question. Now, productivity, it's very important to understand what productivity means. It does not mean an increase in output. It means producing more with the same resources. To express it in terms of the workforce, it means for the same number and quality of hours worked, we're getting more output of services and of goods. It doesn't mean an increase in the gross domestic product. So we've had, growing gross domestic product now for decades. We've avoided a recession in ways that are quite remarkable and really, but that's not increase in productivity. That's just an increase in output. And it's been driven by growth in population in large part. So our productivity growth is now very low. And are migrants assisting? Well, I don't think there's much evidence that they are, because we've had high migration and low productivity growth. Just those two things have been going together now for quite a long time. Now, it's possible that our productivity growth would have been even lower without the migration, but there's no, you can't rule that out, but I think it's unlikely. One of the reasons I think that the link is not strong, well, there are two reasons. One is that many of the migrants themselves, at least for the first few years of their employment in Australia, are not using their skills to their fullest. And part of that, it's a really important point, part of that is because of English language skills. Remembering the change in these sources of our migrants is increasingly away from English-speaking countries towards countries where English is not the native language. And particularly in the production of services. Now, services, unlike producing goods, tangible, hard things, services are often a joint product between the service provider and the recipient and the customer. You think of education, for example, or aged care or financial services. You work with the customer to produce the service. So if it's the cultural fit and the language skill become more important in the production of those goods, those services, those things, than it is if you're, building a bridge, right, or building a house. So I think that might be one reason. Another reason is the fast rate of population growth and the fact that the capital stock's not keeping up with that. So there's less capital per worker. And that reduces productivity, because the main way that you get an increase in productivity is through more and better equipment and software and so on to work with. The evidence, I haven't done this work myself, but the evidence from researchers, and it's not peculiar to Australia, is that migration, including skilled migration, adds to GDP growth, but it adds a tiny bit to the income per head of the population, or the consumption per head, which is a measure of your material standard of living. But not very much to the natives. The principal recipients of this increase in income per head are the migrants. So, it's good for the people who migrate here and choose to come here, and I'm sure many of them are very fine contributors to our society. But then they're not in a meaningful way increasing the standard of living of Australians who are already resident here. Most Australian firms, indeed numbers I've seen recently, are that only about 2% of Australian firms actually do original research. That is, they come up with ideas that nobody else has thought of. Nearly all Australian firms get their ideas from elsewhere. And of course, it's new ideas that's the source of our productivity growth. One of the interesting things is that a lot of our permanent migrants are now coming from people who studied in Australia. So if they've studied in Australia and got their ideas here, they're not bringing new original ideas from the rest of the world with them. They're like our own students, like the native students. So if we think of skilled migrants as being able to they've had, education and experience in cutting edge production and technology in other parts of the world, and then they come to Australia and bring that with them, that human capital, as economists like to call it, for better or worse, that you can see could increase our productivity. But we're doing less and less of that, and we're not very targeted at that very high skill end and high knowledge end. So that's another reason why I think that our migration program is not having much of an impact on the creativity and entrepreneurialism and innovation that we really need more of in our economy.
Sounds like you were describing the creme de la creme of attracting the top talent around the world with that last point. You've had a front row seat to the evolution of migration policy over a number of decades now, Professor Richardson. What gives you hope as we look to the future? Is there any reason for a bit of hope?
Oh, there's every reason for hope. Look, I think personally Australia is a much more interesting place because of our migration. My own view is that it's too rapid. Our population growth is too fast. And I would feel that whether it was natural increase or migration, just population growth is too fast. It's too fast for the complementary built and natural capital that goes with it. I think it's overwhelming and causing more destruction of our natural environment than, that personally I care a lot about. After all, Australian environment's unique. If we don't care for it and protect it, then nobody else will. So I think the population pressure and the growth is too fast. And Australia's in the rare position, most countries can't do this, but we're in the rare position of being able to determine our rate of growth of population because 2/3 of it comes from migration. So I think that the total level is too fast. I think I think the university and the higher education sector is doing a fabulous job in providing education both to people who then stay here, but those who return to their home countries. I think where our temporary migration system is out of control, and it should be revisited. And I think that one of the problems with the temporary migration program is it's uncapped, but also people move from one temporary visa to another. And they stay here for years and years on temporary visas. Now, that seems to me to be quite an unsatisfactory arrangement, both for them and for the country, because employers don't want to invest a lot of effort into training up people who are on temporary, who may then have to leave the country the next year or so. And I might just make the point that when it comes to the development of skills, employers are incredibly important. Skills development doesn't just happen in the education system. In fact, a very large proportion of it happens on the job. And so we want our migrants to be ones that employers are happy to invest a lot of resources into skilling up to have the qualities and capacities that they need. But overall, Australia's done remarkably well in absorbing this very large migrant population, and I think we could do it much better if we slowed down the rate of growth, if we got the temporary migration under control, and we focused. I think the skills and demand list is silly. I could talk about that if you like, and I would abolish that. In many people's thinking, and certainly in discussion, a skill shortage is really a labour shortage, right? So when a firm says, I can't find these people, they're saying, I've got a skill shortage. No, they haven't. There just aren't enough workers, right? And there are lots of skills. Almost everybody who works has a skill, right? So the skill shortages that matter and that need some sort of policy response, in my view, only those that are hard to learn, that take a long time, and this is a crucial point, the absence of that skill is a bottleneck to the production or delivery of some important services, including public services and policy making. Otherwise, the labour market will sort it out. Doesn't need a policy intervention. So, for example, if the whole AI, IT, cybersecurity stuff is a whole new area that's rapidly developing. It's unlikely that we have enough people with really top-level current understanding of those things. It takes time and skill to get on top of all that. It would seem to me that we do have a skill shortage there, and migration, carefully targeted, could help us with that. But if you have a look, also, after all, I'm an academic, I think world-class intellects and researchers in just about any field would be a very welcome addition to our workforce and population. But to get on the skills and demand list, you just have to make a case. And it seems to be something of a status symbol to have your occupation on the skills and demand list. So we have, to my mind, kind of ridiculous jobs on the list. Animal attendants, antique dealers, acupuncturists, even barristers. I mean, they're skilled, but we've got, if we want more, we just have to let more into the universities, really. There's no shortage of people wanting to be barristers. The impediments are, in our education system, not a lack of people wanting to get that skill. I'm not saying animal attendants are not important. They clearly are. But Australians are perfectly capable of doing that job. We do not need to import. Give our priority to people who have that capacity. And if anyone looks at the skills and demand list, they will find their own examples of ones that they're not highly skilled. They're not crucial, So acupuncturists might be very helpful for people who get a benefit from that. But, the economy is not going to stop if we don't have more acupuncturists. And my own particular beef is with chefs. Chefs have been on the skills and demand lists from the beginning that it was ever first created. It's never been solved. It's always been a skill and demand. So there's something wrong with our skills development system if we can't grow our own chefs, and we need to import them. And just continuously relying on immigrants to fill those jobs for you is saying your own skill development system isn't doing the best job.
Professor, I'm sure we could go on, but it is probably time to wrap it up. Thank you so much for your time.
You're most welcome. It's been an enjoyable conversation.
And that brings us to the end of this episode of Made in Migration. Once again, a big thank you to Professor Sue Richardson for sharing her expertise and helping us navigate the big questions around migration and the labour market. If you enjoyed this conversation, don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave us a review. Until next time, thanks for listening. You've been listening to a Lawgration production. This podcast is intended for education and/or entertainment purposes only. All content is current at the time of recording and subject to change without prior notice. While Lawgration is an incorporated legal practice, we are not aware of your personal circumstances, needs, or goals, and information contained in this podcast should not be construed as legal, immigration, or other advice. Before acting on any information in this podcast, you should always query whether it is relevant to your circumstances and consult an Australian immigration lawyer or registered migration agent.